Hello, everybody. I'm John Hutchinson. What Emma didn't mention is that she's also my boss at Ambition Institute. So there's like an additional level of pressure here, having her hosting, which is wonderful. I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm very excited to be talking to you. Let's do this. 7 distinctions every subject leader should know about. I'm John Hutchinson. I'm an assistant head teacher at Reach Academy, Feltham. We are an all-through school. We have children from 2 to 18, and I'm a primary teacher. I have taught most year groups in primary, and a few years ago I also started working in our sixth form, teaching an A level. So I've been very, very lucky, and I'm really aware throughout this presentation as I share some of the things that we've been doing. We have a bunch of privileges that a lot of other schools don't, and one of them is having children all the way through. But that's also sort of given us a bit of a unique perspective on things like curriculum and sequencing curriculum. So I hope to talk a little bit about that. As well as that, one day a week I work for Ambition Institute as a visiting fellow. And what we do is we try to take the best available evidence, especially recent evidence from things like cognitive science, curriculum theory, assessment theory, and we support teachers who are working in classrooms to apply that and translate it into their context in a way that works with their children and their classrooms. That's me. Over the last week, I've also, as Emma said, been working for the Oak Academy, teaching there. If you've seen any of those videos, then you'll notice that I'm not a great teacher. I'm quite a mediocre teacher. That, for me, is why I think curriculum is so important, because we can't guarantee, we have like 450,000 teachers. Not all teachers are going to be absolutely fantastic. Some are going to be a bit mediocre like me. And so although within teaching, we're going to have a sort of spread, what we can guarantee for every kid is a really great curriculum. And so I'm very passionate about curriculum. And over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been thinking hard about how we design curriculum, how we structure it, how we sequence it. And I want to share some of the lenses. So first of all, what is curriculum? I'm going to do a curriculum metaphor. We like curriculum metaphors. Curriculum is... what is it? It's a torch. Okay, so curriculum is a torch. That's what curriculum is. How is it a torch? Well, one of the ways I like to conceptualize curriculum is by thinking about Sir Isaac Newton's famous quote that if I've seen father, it's only by standing on the shoulders of giants. And something that's unique about humans is culture. We don't start from scratch. Every generation gets to build on what the previous generation has already discovered, has already accumulated, has already created the most wonderful novels, the greatest scientific discoveries, the most beautiful pieces of art. We don't have to start from scratch. And for me, that's what curriculum is in school. We're passing that torch from one generation to another. It's a tremendous responsibility and also a huge privilege. And that's why I think it requires great thought. So humans are fairly unique because we're able to learn horizontally. So we can learn from our peers. We can learn from others in real time. And we have also vertical learning structures where we can learn from elders, from people who have already made the mistakes. But something that's unique to humans is that we can learn from our ancestors. We can take that accumulated wisdom and knowledge and we can store it in things like books. And we can learn from thousands of other generations that came before us. And this ability to pass on knowledge is what makes us so unique. It's what makes us so creative, so inventive. It's what's put us at the top of the food chain. It's also just like, a lot of this stuff is like quite instrumentalist. It allows you to write. Why do we study Shakespeare? Shakespeare's just worth reading. It's a fascinating analysis of the human condition. Why do we listen to Beethoven? Because it's worth listening to. It's moving. And incrementally, we get better and better and better. So because our ancestors invented the wheel, we can invent the automobile. And everybody's life gets better better and happier, and humans flourish to a greater level. So the evolutionary biologist Mark Pagel puts it like this. He says, having culture, this accumulated wisdom, this accumulated knowledge, the curriculum, having that is why we watch 3D TVs and build cathedrals, while our close genetic relatives, chimps, sit in the forest as they have for millions of years, cracking the same nuts and stones. So this is an extract from Ian Leslie and his fantastic book, Curious, which I'm going to be talking a little bit later. I'm going to be talking a bit more about later on. But curriculum is a tremendous responsibility. It doesn't happen by accident. This passing on doesn't happen by accident. For some of our children, if they don't get this in school, they won't get it at all. And that's why we have such tremendous responsibility as teachers, as leaders, as subject leads and heads of department. That's why we have such tremendous responsibility to make sure that we get it right within our classroom. So the 7 distinctions, I'm going to run through 7 distinctions. In each of these, I'm going to talk about the distinctions, some of the research that underpins these, how we've tried to translate that into our classrooms and our subjects. And I'm going to, for each of these, I'm going to give a little pause for thought and a few questions to hopefully prompt some thinking in terms of how it will apply to your classroom. I wouldn't dream to tell you how to structure things. What I hope this will do is just give you some lenses, give you some theoretical sort of lenses to look at the way that you do things and perhaps sort of revisit and evaluate the way that you structure your curriculum and your offer for your kids. So the first one is working memory versus long-term memory. If you watched Adam's talk yesterday, he gave a wonderful explanation of this. And we think that this is really important. All of our teachers, all of our subject leads talk about working memory, the difference between working memory and long-term memory, and have conceptualized this and have this in their head when they're thinking about their curriculum at a micro scale in terms of just how a lesson is structured, and at a macro scale in terms of how we sequence whole sort of key stages and even between key stages. And so I'm grateful to Oliver Cavioli, who has conceptualized this really wonderfully, the difference between working memory and long-term memory. So we have the environment that's you in the classroom, or the content that you want pupils to learn. We want pupils attending to that. We want pupils attending to the environment, to the content. That goes into the working memory, which we know is severely limited. The working memory is easily overloaded, necessarily so. If your working memory was super expansive and you could take in dozens of pieces of information, the world would be a nightmare because you constantly bombarded. Present in mind, there would be dozens of different things occupying your mind. That would be horrible. So the working memory is necessarily limited. And that's what school is like for your kids. That's what your lessons are like for your kids. It's all new for them. And so we have to respect that bottleneck of working memory. That's then taken into the long-term memory, encoded into long-term memory, and we retrieve that from long-term memory. So how do we use this at Reach? Well, this really is what we might like to call the standard model of teaching and learning at Reach Academy. Just as other disciplines have their standard models, and Nick Rose, who also teaches on the Ambition Masters in Expert Teaching course, has a nice way of putting this: of all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. And this model of working memory and long-term memory is useful for teachers. It underpins everything we do in all of the conversations. It gives us a shared language. It gives us a way to think about lesson planning and when we go in to do coaching sessions. So here's just one example. It might be in the way that we structure slides. So when we think about our lessons, we'll be really careful at making sure we don't bombard children with tons and tons of information at once. and that we don't split their attention too much. So this is an example from one of our Year 5 Middle East units, and one simple map with all of the information embedded within the map can be used to model over sort of 5 minutes by a teacher so that they can break down exactly what's happening. Then one key question will appear that allows them, the child, to sort of reconstruct all of that knowledge that they've just been learned using that single cue that they have. And the shared language is helpful because when we give action steps, so we have a coaching cycle, instructional coaching cycle, when we give action steps, then we can say something to teachers like, I think that it would be good if you reduce the cognitive load on pupils while you are modeling by revealing the steps as you went along. So if you were talking about 3 different reasons that Christianity took a long time to spread beyond the Middle East, you would be explaining that here, and what you might do is jot down in a different location those key steps so that pupils can store that sort of knowledge somewhere else, so it doesn't have to occupy their working memory, and return to it later when they're reconstructing it. And being able to have that standard model, being able to ensure that all teachers have learned some about cognitive load theory and the simple model of mind means that we can have those conversations with that shared language. So probably the best starting point for this is Professor Dan Willingham, who spoke on Monday, and his excellent book. If you only read one book during this lockdown period, I'd really recommend his book, Why Don't Students Like School? And these cognitive principles can permeate everything that you do in terms of thinking about curriculum and at a teaching level and at a planning level. So I'm going to give a moment to pause for thought. If you're watching this later on Dave, then you can pause the YouTube video now and mull over these. For those of us who are live, I'm just going to pop them up. Hopefully it'll spark some thoughts, and then I'm going to move on for the sake of time. So when you're planning your lessons, when you're designing your materials for your curriculum, how often are you considering cognitive overload? How much information you're presenting to pupils at one time? How many pieces of information you're expecting them to juggle? Different topics, different ideas have different intrinsic loads. What cognitive psychologists sometimes call high element interactivity. More moving parts and more abstract parts. So which topics that you teach have that higher intrinsic load? And how do you combat that? How do you break down those complex ideas into manageable chunks so that pupils during instruction can process everything that you're telling them and encode it into long-term memory? And lastly, if what we're aiming for in long-term memory is that well-organized schema, what does that look like in your topic? What does a really good schema look like in your topic? Second distinction, we've got working memory and long-term memory. Second key distinction that we need to know about is the difference between substantive knowledge and disciplinary knowledge. So I'll let Christine Council do the talking here because she, of course, is the authority on this. So first of all, think about your subject as a discipline. And your subject within the discipline, within individual topics in the discipline, there will be established facts. There will be common conventions, common knowledge, warranted accounts of reality, so justified sort of a knowledge. And that's what we just call the substantive knowledge. It's the stuff, it's the facts. But that's not all there is to your discipline. Because as well as that substantive knowledge, we want pupils to develop as scholars within our disciplines. They also need to know about how we got there. How did we arrive at that established fact? What counts as good warrants? If we say it's warranted account, what counts as a good reason, a good justification? How is it revised? What's the degree of certainty attached? And through, as we're teaching, we want to interweave these substantive and disciplinary questions and concepts and themes and procedures for our children. So how do we translate that into practice? Well, one of the things that we do at Reach is first of all, we curate that substantive knowledge really carefully in a really fine-grained way. So this is a Middle East knowledge organizer for our year 5s. And before we start the topic, we go to the scholars, we go to the sources, we go to the authorities, the disciplinary authorities, scholars working within the field, and we note down what is established fact, what is substantive knowledge. And we start with that curated substantive knowledge, and that's useful for the teacher and it's useful for the pupil. This is the stuff that we expect you to know by the end of this unit. It's a gauntlet we throw down to ourselves and our pupils. By the end of this unit, we all need to know this stuff. But then throughout the unit, we'll try and weave in that disciplinary side. Now, this is from one of our year 3 units of work on the Anglo-Saxons and Scots. And this is a page from a booklet, and you'll see that there's some information here, and it's about two monks, one called the Venerable Bede and one called Gilda Sapiens, and they were monks who wrote about the Anglo-Saxon period. It's one of the ways that we know about the Anglo-Saxons, and so this is starting to introduce some disciplinary themes to the pupils, that we find out about the past from sources. But another disciplinary skill that historians have is assessing and probing reliability. They don't just go to sources and accept it at face value. They'll assess reliability. And so we ask our pupils to do the same thing. We give them a question that focuses their attention towards assessing reliability. So we ask them, do you think that Bede's work is more or less reliable than Gilda Sapiens' work? Is it more or less reliable? And at this point in year 3, we don't really mind whether they get it wrong or right. We just want to be introducing this idea that as historians, we probe reliability. We question how much we can trust the source, and that will then lead to how much certainty we give to what they're saying. So to recap, disciplinary knowledge, how knowledge within a discipline, your discipline, how it's established, the methods and epistemology of a subject. It's different for all subjects. That's why we can't have sort of a blanket transferable curriculum packages. You will need to translate this into your subject and your discipline, which you will know best. So to take an example in history, we might be establishing and categorizing causes. That might be something that a disciplinary skill that scholars are doing. We might be analyzing sources. We might be probing reliability, sorry. And disciplinary knowledge is specialized, different for different subjects, for different disciplines. And it's also often non-intuitive. So it's not something that kids just pick up as they go along. You don't just become a historian by accident. You don't just become a geographer by accident. You need to be inducted and trained in that disciplinary knowledge. So I'll give you just an example of that. Within my subject, religious studies, that's what I teach at A-level. One piece of disciplinary knowledge that biblical historians use is this wonderful idea, this criterion of embarrassment. So the criterion of embarrassment dictates that the more embarrassing that an event would have been for somebody, the more likely it is that it happened if that person is saying that it did. The idea is that if something's embarrassing, you're more likely to rewrite history. You're more likely to change it if you're the one presenting it, to put you in a good light. So if it's embarrassing, it's more likely to be true. We can attach a greater weight of certainty on it. And so Christ's crucifixion is a good example of this. Being crucified was a very shameful method of execution. It's what happened to common criminals. It was embarrassing. There's also Old Testament scripture that says that those who hang on a tree will be cursed. And so the fact that early Christians, early followers of Christ, said that this is what happened to their God, who's supposed to be all powerful, is very embarrassing and shameful. And so it's more likely to be true. It's just one example of disciplinary knowledge that we can interweave, that I can do that in religious studies. You will have different examples within your subject, but how do you interweave and introduce those examples as you teach content to your pupils in your subject? So first to consider, we've got substantive knowledge and disciplinary knowledge. You need to define that substantive knowledge. What is it within the topics taught within your subject? How well have you defined and fine-grained and curated those different pieces of information? We can't leave this to chance. And what does disciplinarity look like in your subject? How are you going to interweave it to expose pupils to those disciplinary processes? Next up is the difference between explicit instruction and discovery learning. So explicit instruction, sometimes called direct instruction, but it can get confused with specific programs called direct instruction with a capital D, capital I, but explicit instruction versus discovery learning, also sometimes called inquiry learning. So I'm going to tell you a story. This was during my PGCE when I was training to be a primary teacher, and I had a science day, and I went to the science room, sat down on the desk with my colleagues, my fellow trainees, and we saw this on the desk in front of us. And it was a load of bulbs and cells and wires ready to make circuits. And I remember the PGCE tutor who was teaching this barely said a word. We sat down, we looked at it, and he just looked at us and he said, "You have everything that you need to be successful. Off you go." And we spent about 20 minutes making circuits and making bulbs flash and doing all sorts of different things. And then he said something, he stopped us and he said something which I'll always remember, because I think it's the worst advice I've ever been given in teaching. He said, every time you tell a child something, you rob them of the opportunity to discover it for themselves. And this for years made me feel guilty in the classroom whenever I just told a child something. Whenever I said, oh, here's a piece of information, here's an interesting fact, I felt so guilty because I thought I should have structured that in a way that let them discover it for themselves. So here's why I think it's a bad idea. I think it's a bad idea because the reason that we were able to be successful in that session was because we were already relative experts at making circuits and cells and batteries. We had sophisticated schemas to draw upon. Our pupils don't. They're still novices in this respect. And novices and experts don't learn in the same way. We have good evidence that novices and experts don't learn in the same way. So David Bellino, leading authority on expertise and especially teacher expertise, emphasizing that novices and experts don't learn in the same way. Novices require explicit instruction broken down step by step with lots of guidance and feedback. If you're a relative expert in a particular domain, then you might be able to sort of play around. And so we probably don't want to conceive of this as a binary and more of a spectrum. But especially in those early days, we don't want to be just allowing pupils to be leading their own learning, and to coin another popular phrase, because it's more likely to lead to a wider gap within your classroom. Those that already have a lot will be able to do more. We get that Matthew effect. Knowledge begets knowledge. So how do we structure this? So this is another page from our booklet. This is again the Middle East, about the Balfour Declaration. And a few things that we do is we'll write down everything that we want pupils to learn, because we think that this text curates that key knowledge in a way that's really helpful for specifying what the domain is going to be, what expertise really looks like, what we expect all children to know. And we break that then into really small chunks. So there'll be a little bit of information, and then there will be a task to focus the children's attention on what they've just been learning about. Because we know that memory is the residue of thought. And so we want the children thinking about what we want them to remember. By structuring it in this way, we limit those sort of off-piste lessons. Of course, every now and then we go on a tangent. Sometimes it's a wonderful tangent and an excellent way of boosting sort of motivation and interest in the topic. But often, I think that 80% of the class switch off as the one or two kids who were interested in this random thing. My kids, because they know that I'm a sucker for this. I know I know their game. I'm wise to it. They use this as a way to be like, let's ask Mr. Hutchinson an interesting question, and that's it. The lesson will be kibosh because he'll go into a huge explanation about this other sort of thing. So it limits off-piste lessons and gets you back on track. It also will support the teacher's subject knowledge. And in presenting it in this way, it buys the teacher time to focus on explanations. It takes off the plate. It takes this off the teacher's plate so that they can think about how best to explain, how best to provide that explicit instruction, those key explanations, breaking it down. Now, you're going to be best at doing that, but you can't do it if you're also trying to plan a whole curriculum from scratch, and you also can't do it if you're expecting pupils to sort of come up with this by themselves. So Paul Kirshner, who wrote a seminal paper, Why Minimal Guidance During Instruction Doesn't Work, has this to say. Overwhelming and unambiguous evidence. Minimal guidance during instruction doesn't work. Significantly less effective and efficient. Some kids will do it. Some kids will sort of womble along and bump into some learning by accident through sort of like inquiry discovery approaches. But it's a fingers crossed approach. And you're way more likely to be successful if you're already top of the class. So pause to think. What's the balance between fully guided instruction in your lessons and more discovery or inquiry-led approaches? As pupils move towards that expertise, as they start to automate those procedures, improve retrieval and master a particular topic, how do you start to fade the guidance? Another phenomenon is sometimes called the expertise reversal effect, that actually as people become more relative experts, sometimes that explicit instruction can get in the way of their learning. So we're thinking about it as that spectrum, and guidance sort of being faded away as they move through. So how do we fade that guidance? And lastly, the difficulty we all have, right, is that we have a mix of kids in our class, some relative novices, some relative experts. That's what makes it difficult. That's what makes teaching difficult. There's a distribution of ability and attainment and prior knowledge. So how do we balance the level of guidance that's required within a class in which pupils will differ on that spectrum from novice to expert? Next one. Performance versus learning. So I'm going to ask you a question. Get ready. Here's the question. What's the capital of Mongolia? Okay, I'm sure given the numbers that we have, I'm sure that one or two people know this, and I want to be your friend. That's really impressive. For those who can't quite recall, the capital of Mongolia is Ulaanbaatar. Okay? What's the capital of Mongolia? Try and say it. Ulaanbaatar. Okay. Maybe I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Apologies if I'm not. So here's another question. Get ready. What's the capital of Mongolia? Wow, amazing. Everybody is so good at geography. I'm a fantastic teacher. You guys are great. You're right, it's Ulaanbaatar. And this time, loads of people got it correct. What just happened? Well, what just happened is we saw performance. We saw performance, which is short-term fluctuations, which are really unstable and not necessarily going to last, and slight improvements in knowledge and behavior, but no indication that they're going to be learned. By learned, we mean stored in the long-term memory process, long-term memory, relatively permanent change. The relationship between performance and learning is really interesting and complex because we can have performance without learning. And an analogy here is sat-nav. You can follow a sat-nav, and in terms of performance, in terms of following each of the steps, you will get to your destination, you will be successful. But in terms of learning the route, not so much. As soon as your sat-nav breaks or there's a problem, then you're stuffed. You don't know how to get to your location or how to get back. So you can have performance without learning. You can also have learning without performance. And the way that we get to learning, that long-term knowledge, that long-term memory, is often by inhibiting short-term performance. So this is what Nik Soderstrom has to say. This is one of those counterintuitive findings. So one of the criticisms of some cognitive psychology and educational research is, hey, this is just common sense. This is what we've all been doing. In lots of cases, that's true. Still great to have it confirmed. This is one of those things that's really counterintuitive. By making performance easier, we can make long-term learning less likely, and vice versa. By inhibiting performance, by making it more difficult in the moment, we can make learning more likely, long-term learning more likely. Now, that doesn't mean just make your lessons really hard by being terrible or making things really complicated. We still want to respect the working memory, break things down. But it does mean that the way that we then sequence those concepts, especially through things like repetition, spacing, and interleaving, can make pupils perform worse in the short term, but better in the longer term. And this is what Nik Soderstrom, who wrote a seminal paper on this, Learning versus Performance and Integrative Review, this is what he has to say about it. So the difficulty is that performance is what we see. Learning is what we infer. We never directly see learning. How can we? Learning is what they will know in the future, what they will have remembered in the future. How long in the future? 6 months, a year, I don't know. We can't necessarily put a sort of like a date on it, but it's in the future, it's in the longer term. We only ever see performance in the classroom, which isn't necessarily a good proxy for learning, and sometimes can be a terrible proxy, because the better they are at performance, the worse they are at learning. So one way that we try to combat this is by revisiting concepts regularly, and by revisiting abstract concepts with concrete examples. So I'm going to let you watch a clip now of Katie Harrison, one of our primary teachers, introducing some conceptual knowledge, but building on a previous idea, so that the earlier learning, the earlier performance is more likely to be consolidated into learning and stored in a more sophisticated, robust way.
As pupils move through the curriculum, there are more and more opportunities to make connections and links with other topics. In this extract, watch how Katie connects the hot air balloon rising with the water cycle that pupils studied last term. Not only does she connect them, but she pushes pupils in pairs to identify exactly how they connect.
what we're going to do now is we are going to read a little bit of our text, and we're going to find out about something really exciting. We're going to find out about how a hot air balloon works. Hands up if you've ever seen a hot air balloon in the sky. They're so exciting, and sometimes I look at them and I'm like, how do they stay in the air? So we are tracking our text, and we're going to read our part. I can see Brandon's got his finger underneath the first words, a hot air balloon. Start us off reading, please. Disha, go for it. So the warm air is rising and the cold air is sinking. Now, what you just read there, Lorenzo, is reminding me of something we've already learnt. It reminds me of the water cycle. Have a think back to our learning about the water cycle. Something rising, something falling. If you're struggling to remember, maybe you can have a look back in your booklets. I want you to turn to your talk partner. How does what we just read about hot air balloons, how does that remind you of the water cycle? Ready to turn to your talk partner, Stanley? Ready, steady, go. Hey, what does it remind you of?
Well, it means it's like a flame and it rises up because it's moving.
Yeah, it's warm and it's hot.
And it rises up.
And it causes warm air.
Yeah, but if it's cold and it
like as the fire
stops, yeah, then it like cools down, so then it sinks, so it like goes down.
Wow, I heard so many great conversations, and I can already see lots of us have got our hands up ready to share. Now, my first question is, what happens to the hot air balloon? Thinking about the air inside it, what happens when that hot air balloon, when that air heats up? Ananya, what happens to the air in that balloon?
When the air is warm, it just rises like the water cycle. And the water cycle, it evaporates, which means it rises and it's the same as what happens in the hot air balloon, but it's just warm air instead of water.
Oh, great job, Ananya.
Okay, so pause for thought. There you saw Katie actually inhibiting performance, getting the pupils to juggle two quite different concepts, two quite different instances of the same concept, bring back to mind previously learned information to consolidate that better in the longer term. So how regularly and how purposefully, intentionally, do you check previously taught material? This for me is why curriculum is an ongoing endeavor, initiative, because I certainly am quite scattergun in the way that I revisit information very often. So how regularly and how purposefully do you check previously taught material? What are the different techniques that you use to deliberately inhibit performance to boost learning? Not making it difficult by teaching badly, but inhibiting performance in ways that will make your brain encode it in a more robust way. And if you look at your curriculum over years, how does curriculum reinforce and consolidate knowledge conceptually over time? Another distinction, our next distinction, is between the core and the hinterland. I love this. We're going back to Christine Council now, this idea of the core and the hinterland. So this is, well, does anybody know who this is? RE philosophy teachers may recognize Immanuel Kant. And I teach Kant when I teach deontological ethics at A level. And I tell a story about Kant that probably every ethics teacher tells, which is about Kant apparently was so regular in his walks in his home village. He would go for a walk every day, and he was so regular and so precise that the villagers would be able to stop, would be able to set their watch by him, by his daily walks. Now, why do I tell this story? They're never going to use it in an exam, or at least I hope that they don't. It's not important to be using an exam, but it's what Christine Council might call the hinterland. It's a way of framing, introducing, contextualizing this person and this idea that we'll be talking about. And it can help with some of the core knowledge. It can help pupils to think about, conceptualize Kant as somebody who's very fastidious, for example, very precise, just as he is in his ethical and philosophical writings. And so Christian Council puts the difference of core and hinterland like this. So I hope that in what has come before, I haven't sounded like I'm advocating something that's very dry and very mechanistic and doesn't sort of respect the beauty and fascination of your subject and your discipline, because it can be reductive in that way when we take this sort of like knowledge rich or sort of like quite rigorous sort of approach. It can be very reductive and we can kill the subject. And so we have to have that balance between core and the hinterland and frame the core within the hinterland, understanding that the core is what needs to remain, needs to be fingertips. So pause and think. We can't just do all hinterland. So what's the core knowledge? What's the residue that's left behind? What are those key facts that you need 100% of pupils to know? We have to define that first. But then which stories, context, additional information help the pupils to frame them, to make sense of them, to contextualize them? And when should you avoid the hinterland? When does it become distracting? Or how do you know when it becomes distracting? Consider the balance of core and hinterland. Fifth, flexible versus inflexible knowledge. So in Dan Willingham, going back to Dan Willingham now, in one of his papers for the AFT, he quotes Richard Lederer, who writes in his book about a student he's teaching, and he asks the student a question, and the student answers, a menagerie lion running around the earth across Africa. What was the question? The pupil said, oh, a menagerie lion running around the earth across Africa. What was the question? Well, the teacher asked the student, what's the equator? And so this humorous example shows us that, well, that pupil had inflexible knowledge. They just learned a definition and not really understood it because they've only heard it, and so they thought it was to do with a menagerie lion instead of an imaginary line. And so this shows that rote learning is bad, memorizing facts is bad. It leads to inflexible knowledge, and the real goal is flexible knowledge. It's problem solving, critical creativity. That's what we want to get to, and so we'll directly teach that, forgetting this rote learning thing. So the rote learning, the learning facts, that's inflexible knowledge. That's the baddie. What we want is flexible knowledge. That's the goodie. That's what we're aiming for. The flaw here is to think that you can go straight to flexible knowledge. The flaw here is to think that you can directly teach flexible knowledge. In fact, what we know is that to get to flexible knowledge, you have to stepping stone through inflexible knowledge. And so the way that we will do this is we will have regular retrieval practice, multiple choice quizzes. We'll fix those facts in kids' brains regularly, getting them just to, at their fingertips, have the key facts. But we recognize that it's inflexible, and that's okay. It's a stepping stone to get to where we want the kids to really do, which is express those ideas in unique and original and commanding ways. Knowledge is power, and they become powerful by knowing that stuff. And so this is an example of one of our kids from year 6, their essay, and they're able to write that essay in such a commanding way. So this question asked them, civil disobedience was more important than legal decisions during the civil rights movement. Do you agree? And this year 6 pupil goes in with rights or a liberty or entitlement to have or do something. Now that's a piece of rote knowledge. That's something that they've learned. but it's really, really helpful in answering this question in a commanding and authoritative way. And we want all of our pupils to have that. And so we give them all the inflexible knowledge first. And it helps them to move to the flexible knowledge. This is what Jeffrey Caprique has to say about it. I'll let you read. So yes, we want that flexible knowledge. We want the meaningful learning. We want it to be long lasting, coherent, well organized, be able to be transferred. Interesting, the way that we get that is through retrieval. So this is from a study by Jeffrey Caprique, where he had pupils do different things. One thing is he gave them, one group he gave an activity where they studied some material, they read some material, and then they drew a concept map. So sort of like a mind map, that's what they drew with connections of what they'd learned. And then they did a test and they got about 60% correct. Another group did the same, so they had the same amount of time to read the material, study the material, but then they did some retrieval practice of some key facts, some key pieces of information, and they performed much better on that final short answer test. So retrieval practice, that rote knowledge can actually lead to better flexible knowledge. Really interestingly though, that wasn't all that they tested. Really interestingly in this study, they then asked both groups to draw a concept map. So only the first group had drawn a concept map. When they then were asked to draw a concept map again, they were able to recall about 30% of the material. And those that did retrieval practice, when they were then asked to do a concept map, there was more information retrieved, organized in a more sophisticated way than those who did the concept maps in the start. So pause to think. Within your discipline, within your subject, within your topics, what are the stepping stones of inflexible knowledge that all kids just need for that to then become, sorry, that should say flexible, for that knowledge to then become flexible? How can we move from the concrete to the abstract? Abstract knowledge, understanding, conceptual knowledge helps us to transfer, to get greater flexibility. So how do we move from concrete examples to abstract examples? How do you signpost examples of individual instances of substantive concepts? Diversive curiosity versus epistemic curiosity. This is the final one, and then we'll go to questions. So this is actually the only one that doesn't come from a strictly education book. It comes from a book called Curious, The Desire to Know and Why Your Future Depends on It by Ian Leslie. And he makes a distinction between two types of curiosity. We often talk about pupils needing to be curious. And Ian Leslie agrees. He says curiosity is the most important non-cognitive skill. So IQ, socioeconomic background, these sort of background characteristics, they account for a lot in terms of predicting how pupils will do. But we can't really control those things. People's IQ and their family backgrounds, we can't really control those things. What we can control perhaps is their levels of curiosity, and that seems to correlate after those cognitive skills with pupil outcomes. So diversive curiosity is that fleeting sort of like dopamine hit of, wow, I'm really interested in something. What a cool leaf. Oh, I've got a Twitter buzz. Amazing. What could this be? It's fleeting. It really excites you and it gives you a little dopamine hit and it feels amazing, but it's easily satiated and it dies pretty much immediately. Epistemic curiosity, on the other hand, is that sort of like thoughtful, lasting engagement of really mastering a topic and really wanting to continue to master a topic. It's much more effortful, but in the long term, it pays off. Greater sort of like, there's a greater payoff in the long term. So we try to embrace both of these. So within our unit on the Shang dynasty, we'll introduce pupils to different sorts of artifacts, sparking their diverse curiosity. Cool, what's this? This looks like a blade. This looks like a bone. What are these cool things? But we don't just stop there. And my worry is that sometimes this can happen with curriculum. We focus on that diverse curiosity because we want things to be engaging and exciting constantly. And so we never take the time to say, right, now we know that this is an oracle bone, which contains some of our oldest records of Chinese writing. Let's find out a little bit more about it. Let's go a little bit deeper. And so after this, we'll also make sure we curate and dictate and have everything that we want pupils to know. All the pupils, we all read that together. So Ian Leslie puts it like this in his book, Curious. So going back to Mark Pagel, that evolutionary biologist from the start of our session, human societies are cultural survival vehicles, and we're each born right from birth. We have a powerful urge to explore it, and our job as teachers is to meet that urge from those pupils, from those children, and make sure that they are given that accumulated wisdom and that accumulated knowledge, and that we pass the torch on to the next generation. So at what points do you pique pupils' diversive curiosity? How do you maintain their focus when it gets a bit more effortful, a bit harder? We want that epistemic curiosity. And what might the implications then be for how you sequence lessons and schemes of work? So that's our seven distinctions that hopefully as theoretical frames will allow you to look at your curriculum and think, how are you accommodating each of these? I'm ready for questions.
Great, thanks, John. So a quick one, first of all, could you just go back and recap for us the difference between core and hinterland knowledge and then disciplinary and substantive knowledge? So those two sets of distinctions, what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I started to rush here because I was running out of time. So core and hinterland, when considering your subject and considering a particular topic, the core knowledge is often described as the sort of the residual knowledge, the stuff that you want pupils to remember in the really, really long term. Often Christian Council calls it sort of like propositional knowledge. So I know that this thing. And having those sort of declarative facts. So we do need to fix those pieces of core knowledge, but the way that we introduce those, the method we introduce those, the way that we frame them, the sort of like context, is often through what she calls the hinterland, the sort of like this sort of like place beyond, which isn't necessarily what we need pupils to remember in the long term. It isn't something that we put on a test, but it gives this core knowledge more meaning. It respects the discipline in a way with more fidelity, because it's more sort of like all-encompassing. And so we need to blend the two of these. That's not quite the same as substantive and disciplinary knowledge. Substantive knowledge is the sort of like, so there's similarities in that we might say that substantive knowledge is core knowledge. It's the key sorts of facts. Substantive knowledge is the what, and disciplinary knowledge is the how. That's the easiest way to sort of like, that's the easiest way, I think, to conceptualize it. Substantive knowledge is the I know that, and that could be procedures, it could be procedural knowledge, but it could also be a declarative knowledge. And disciplinary knowledge is within each discipline, it's unique for each discipline. It's how we establish that knowledge, how certain it is, because it could be changed, and how we go about challenging it and arriving at it.
Great, thanks for that. And I've got one I'm really keen to squeeze in before 12 o'clock. Considering the early years foundation studies context, there are often some interesting debates around exploratory learning or inquiry-based discovery learning in that context. Could you just, if you can squeeze in some ideas on how things might change, considering the EYFS context?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a level of nuance that I didn't include, and so I'm really glad that somebody's brought that in, because first of all, our EYFS colleagues, in my opinion, are absolute masters in explicit instruction. If you want to see the best explicit instruction that you'll ever see, go to an early years classroom and you will see those early years workers. You will see them working with pupils, breaking down things, starting with almost nothing and breaking down things into their smallest parts, giving pupils a chance to practice and apply, giving little bits of feedback, and then building on that tiny bit by tiny bit. It's really amazing to see. There will also be aspects where where children in early years classrooms are doing discovery learning or inquiry-based learning, and that's absolutely right and absolutely appropriate. And I think in lots of cases, that's because what they're doing is they're doing what the evolutionary biologist David Geary would call biologically primary stuff. So David Geary makes a distinction between biologically primary culture, or biologically primary knowledge, which is stuff that we've just sort of evolved to do. It's things like social interactions. It's things like imaginary play. It's things like speaking. We all, well, pretty much all of us, just develop these things naturally. Even when we find kids sort of like in forests and isolated away, they still develop some sort of like pidgin language. They speak. There's also biologically secondary culture. That's stuff like writing. We don't just evolve that. So if you just leave somebody without writing, well, we know this, we've done this experiment for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, nobody learned to write. That's because you need explicit instruction, because it's biologically secondary. Now, the early years practitioners will be doing a blend of both of these things. They'll be doing a phonics lesson, which requires explicit instruction because their kids are learning to write and it's biologically secondary. And the kids will also be doing some discovery learning where they'll be sort of like developing naturally those sorts of biologically primary skills. And I think second of all, like some of that inquiry stuff will be a practice and applying of those explicitly learned pieces of procedural knowledge, because at that age kids just take a little bit longer to apply that stuff and require a bit more practice and doing that a few more times. I think that's my answer to that.
Great, thank you. And as we've just got almost a minute left and we've got lots more questions, where could people go to learn more about this? People have particularly asked for reading around substantive and disciplinary knowledge, but curriculum in general.
So what a great question. Within this, I put 5 links in the research ed in the schedule. You'll find 5 links, and they include, so the substantive and the disciplinary knowledge. The best starting place is Christine Council's article in the Chartered College of Teaching, the Impact Journal. It's called Taking Curriculum Seriously. That's a really good start. There have been others who have written great blogs on this. If you buy just one book that really gets it right, in my opinion, on substantive and disciplinary knowledge as a starting point, it would be this one. So this is Summer Turner's book. It's secondary curriculum and assessment design, but I'm a primary teacher, and I found this really, really wonderful for primary as well. I think it should just say curriculum and assessment design. And that includes a lengthy discussion of substantive and disciplinary knowledge and some great activities, some reflective activities for you to apply it as well. So I would start with that book and that article.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, John. Thanks to everyone that's joined us today. A reminder that the recording of today's session will be up on the YouTube channel as soon as we've got it downloaded. Thanks for all your questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. And a big thanks again to you, John. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much for joining, everybody.
Great. Thanks, everyone.